The morning Caleb Turner was fired, the sky above the Titan Motors facility was the pale gray of old engine oil, and the air smelled of metal shavings and the faint ozone bite of industrial electricity. He had driven to the plant the same way he always did, windows down regardless of the temperature, because he preferred to hear the engine of his own truck without distortion. He could tell you within the first 8 seconds of ignition whether the day's drive would be clean or whether something small and insistent had shifted overnight in a way that would need attention. That morning, the truck ran clean. It was the last ordinary thing that would happen for a very long time. Caleb had worked in engine diagnostics for 21 years. He had started on the floor of a regional automotive repair shop in Cincinnati at the age of 21, learning the way most men of his generation learned things that mattered, not through coursework, but through proximity and patience, through standing close to people who knew more than he did, and paying attention in a way that most of those people had stopped doing years before he arrived. He did not have an engineering degree. He had something that a degree could not reliably produce: the ability to hear a machine as if it were a living thing with a language of its own, and to understand what that language was saying before the instruments caught up. By the time he joined Titan Motors 11 years ago, his reputation had preceded him in the specific way reputations travel in specialized industries. Not loudly, but with the quiet certainty of a fact that people who need to know already know. He had prevented a catastrophic valve failure at a hypercar manufacturer in Stuttgart by identifying a harmonic resonance signature in the exhaust manifold 6 weeks before the engineering team's sensors flagged anything unusual. He had caught a cooling system fault in a prototype sports sedan that had passed 3 separate diagnostic reviews because the fault expressed itself as a frequency shift so small that it fell below the threshold of every piece of equipment in the facility, except for Caleb's listening. He had done these things without fanfare and without documentation because the people who hired him never asked for documentation. They asked for results. He had always provided them. At Titan Motors, he was classified as a senior technical specialist, a title broad enough to mean almost anything and specific enough to mean almost nothing in the context of a company that had, over the past 4 years, invested nearly $800 million in AI-driven diagnostic systems and automated quality control infrastructure. The facility had been redesigned twice in that period to accommodate the new technology. The floors were cleaner. The robots were quieter. The dashboards in the control room glowed with a continuous stream of data that updated 400 times per second and could identify material stress in a drive shaft to within 3 decimal places of tolerance. Julian Cross, who ran the AI diagnostic division, liked to say that the facility had become the most precisely monitored manufacturing environment in the automotive industry. He said it at every presentation Caleb had ever attended. He seemed to believe it more each time he said it. There was a version of this narrative told from inside the company's annual reports and its investor materials, in which the transition to AI-led diagnostics represented the logical and inevitable evolution of a manufacturing philosophy that had always prized precision above sentiment. In that version, human technicians like Caleb were not erased, but elevated, freed from the limitations of embodied perception, liberated to focus on the higher-order work of interpretation rather than the lower-order work of detection. It was a story the company told well. The design of the facility supported it. The photographs in the investor deck reinforced it. The numbers for a time seemed to confirm it. What the numbers could not show, because numbers by their nature measure what has already happened rather than what is in the process of becoming, was the particular kind of knowledge that Caleb carried in his listening. 21 years of standing inside working machines, learning their languages through proximity and patience, had given him something that no algorithm, regardless of its sophistication, had yet been designed to replicate: the capacity to hear not just what a machine was doing, but what it was about to do. This was not mysticism. It was pattern recognition operating at a resolution finer than the instruments surrounding it, trained on a dataset of experience large enough and specific enough to be genuinely predictive. Caleb could not have explained it in the technical language that Julian Cross's team used for their system specifications, and he had stopped trying years ago. He simply knew what he heard. He had always been right about it. And in the current environment of the Titan facility, that knowledge had become quietly and without announcement the thing that was most in the way. Caleb had a son named Noah who was 10 years old and who had inherited neither Caleb's silence nor his restraint, but had inherited fully and unmistakably his father's particular fascination with the way machines sounded when they were working and when they were not. Noah had been 4 years old when Caleb's wife Rebecca died of an aneurysm in the kitchen of their house in a suburb 30 minutes east of the plant. She had been making coffee. The coffee had finished brewing before anyone knew anything was wrong. Caleb had raised Noah alone in the same house since then, and he had done it with the same economy of motion and the same careful attention to what was true that he brought to every other task in his life. Noah went to school. Noah ate dinner. Noah was heard when he spoke and corrected when he was wrong, and held to account for small things because Caleb believed that small things were where character was actually built. Noah liked to tell anyone who would listen that his father could hear a car engine better than any computer ever built. He said it with the unself-conscious certainty of a child who has not yet learned that authority requires credentials to be believed by the world, and who does not yet understand why that fact should matter to anyone. The Aurora-X had been Titan Motors' primary strategic initiative for 3 years. It was a hybrid electric powertrain system mounted in a vehicle platform that the company's marketing materials described as the convergence of performance and responsibility, a phrase that had been approved by 17 people across 4 departments and had been stripped of everything genuinely interesting in the process. The prototype had been in testing for 8 months. The launch date was 7 weeks away. The investor presentation was in 11 days. The pressure inside the facility had the specific texture of a place where everyone understood that the window for any kind of problem had already closed, and that anyone who introduced a problem into that window would not be forgiven for it. Caleb had walked onto the test floor at 6:47 in the morning on the day of his termination, 90 minutes before the standard shift began, because he always arrived early and always spent the first hour simply standing near the machinery in the quiet before the day's noise filled the space. He carried no instruments. He never carried instruments during the first hour. The instruments he had found were most useful once you already knew where to look. Before you knew where to look, they could send you in directions that confidence in measurement made difficult to question. He stood near the Aurora-X prototype for 12 minutes. The engine ran at low idle, a sound so smooth and continuous that most ears would process it as silence. Caleb did not process it as silence. He processed it the way a musician processes a note that is very slightly below pitch, not as a defect in the scale, but as a signal that something in the underlying structure has not settled into alignment. He heard it on the 7th minute. A variation so small that it occupied no more than a fraction of a second in any given cycle, a pressure differential in the secondary thermal chamber that expressed itself as a shift in tonal quality so subtle that it would not have registered as sound to anyone who was not listening for it. Caleb listened for it, because he was always listening for the thing that was not supposed to be there, and because he had learned over 2 decades that the things that were not supposed to be there were always the things that mattered most. He requested a halt to the morning's test run at 7:12 before Julian Cross arrived and before Victoria Sterling's assistant had forwarded the day's schedule to her phone. The floor supervisor, a careful man named Dennis, who had worked at the facility for 9 years and who had enough experience with Caleb's instincts to take them seriously, relayed the request through proper channels without editorializing. Julian Cross arrived at 7:38 in a car that cost 4 times what Caleb's truck was worth, and parked it in a space that had been added to the executive row 6 months ago. He was 34 years old, with the particular confidence of someone who had been told from an early age that intelligence was his primary quality and had never had sufficient reason to doubt it. His AI diagnostic division had delivered measurable results in 3 consecutive quarters, and he had the quarterly reports laminated and framed in his office, which Caleb had noted once and never mentioned to anyone. Julian looked at the halted test floor and then at Caleb, and then at the data screens which showed nominal readings across every monitored system, and he produced the expression of a man who considers himself above the kind of frustration he is actually feeling. "Our systems show a clean run," he said. "Every parameter within specification. There's a pressure variance in the secondary thermal chamber," Caleb said. "Tonal shift on the pressure cycle. 6-point-something milliseconds. Recurring." Julian looked at the screens again, then back at Caleb, with the specific patience of someone demonstrating patience for an audience. The AI monitors 400 data points simultaneously. If there were a pressure variance, we would know. You would know when it became large enough for the sensors to register. I'm telling you what it's going to become before it gets there. You're telling me you heard something that our equipment didn't detect. That's correct, Caleb. Julian said his name, the way people use names when they want the name to do the work of an argument. We have 7 weeks to launch. We have an investor presentation in 11 days. We cannot halt testing because of something you think you heard. Caleb looked at the prototype. He looked at it the way he always looked at engines, not with admiration, not with sentiment, but with the careful attention of someone reading a document written in a language that most people around him did not speak. In 72 hours, he said, the thermal variance will cascade through the primary coupling. The coupling will fail. The failure will propagate through the production line. There was a pause in which several people on the floor found reasons to look somewhere other than at Caleb or Julian. That is not possible, Julian said. The system design has redundancies specifically engineered to prevent cascade failure. The redundancies are calibrated against parameters your sensors can measure. The fault I'm describing is below that threshold. Victoria Sterling arrived at 8:15, which was earlier than her usual arrival, and which suggested that Dennis or someone had sent word upward. She was 39 years old, and had been the chief executive of Titan Motors for 3 years, appointed by a board that had needed someone willing to make the Aurora-X launch the organizing principle of the company's near-term future. She was not a reckless person. She had made the decision to center the company's strategy around the Aurora-X after careful analysis and with a clear understanding of what failure at this stage would mean. That understanding was precisely what made flexibility at this point something she could not afford. She listened to the situation in 6 minutes. Then she looked at Caleb with the expression of someone who has been required to make a decision they would prefer not to make, and has decided to make it cleanly rather than slowly. Mr. Turner, she said, I understand that you have strong instincts, and I understand that those instincts have been valuable in the past. But we cannot halt testing on this prototype based on something that our diagnostic systems have not confirmed. The schedule is not adjustable. With respect, Caleb said the schedule being unadjustable doesn't change what's going to happen. Victoria met his eyes for a moment. Her expression did not harden. It simply settled the way a decision settles once it has been made. Your position with this facility is terminated effective today. HR will provide you with the relevant documentation. You are welcome to dispute the decision through the standard process. She paused. I'm sorry it ended this way. She said it as if she meant it, which made it worse. The moment that followed lived in the memory of everyone on that floor in different ways, depending on what each person had invested in the outcome. Dennis, the floor supervisor, looked at the concrete. 2 technicians near the eastern bay found reasons to examine their clipboards. Julian Cross maintained the expression of a man who has been vindicated without quite achieving the satisfaction he expected vindication to provide. Caleb reached into the pocket of his work jacket and removed his access badge. He set it on the surface of the equipment table beside him, not with drama, not with force, but with the quiet precision he brought to every physical action. He looked at the prototype once more, and the look he gave it was not anger and was not defeat. It was the specific look of a man who has said what was true and has been heard and not believed, and who knows without pleasure what that means for what comes next. He picked up his toolbox from the floor beside the station. It was a worn metal case, its latches replaced twice over the years, its surface marked with the accumulated history of 2 decades of work. Inside it were tools he had accumulated and maintained the way a surgeon maintains instruments, not because they were expensive, but because their reliability was a condition of everything else he did. He walked to the exit without looking back. Noah was waiting outside the facility gate, which meant that school had not yet started, and that Caleb had texted him earlier to wait rather than taking the bus. Noah was sitting on the low wall beside the parking lot, with a paperback novel balanced on one knee, his coat open despite the cold reading. With the focused attention he applied to things that interested him. He looked up when Caleb came through the gate, and read something in his father's face that caused him to close the book. They didn't listen, Noah said. It was not a question. They didn't, Caleb said. Noah looked at his father for a moment. He was 10 years old, but he had been living with a specific kind of grown-up reality since he was 4, and it had made him older than his age in the particular way that certain kinds of loss make children older, not sadder, not harder, but more attentive to what was real. What are we going to do? What we always do, Caleb said. We go home. We figure out what's next. Noah accepted this. He slid off the wall and fell in beside his father as they walked toward the truck. After a few paces, he said, "The engine still sounds good at least." Caleb looked at him. Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile but occupied the same space as one. "Yeah," he said. "The truck's fine." What neither of them said because it did not need to be said was that Caleb's certainty about the prototype was not the kind that faded with rejection. He had been wrong before, in the way that anyone working with extremely small variables is occasionally wrong. But the feeling in his chest, as he drove away from the Titan facility that morning, was not uncertainty. It was the quiet, joyless knowledge of someone watching a clock run down. Inside the facility, Titan motors accelerated. Victoria approved an extension of the daily test run window, adding 4 hours to the afternoon cycle to make up for the morning delay. Julian's team recalibrated the monitoring thresholds upward to filter what he characterized as noise in the secondary thermal data, a decision made with the confidence of a man whose instruments told him everything he needed to know. The production floor operated at capacity. The ambient sound of the facility settled into the particular rhythm of a system running exactly as fast as it could. 36 hours after Caleb's termination, a technician on the night shift named Marcus noticed a vibration in the southern test bay that he did not recognize. He had been at the facility for 4 years. He had worked night shifts for 2 of those years and had developed the specific alertness of someone whose job required sustained attention in a building full of repetitive sounds. The vibration was subtle enough that he was not entirely certain he was feeling it and not imagining it. He logged it in the night report under minor anomaly monitoring and continued his shift. The morning crew found the same vibration. It was measurably stronger by 6 hours later. Julian's system flagged it as within acceptable operational parameters because the threshold had been adjusted and the vibration was not yet large enough to exceed the new threshold. 2 engineers on Julian's team discussed it privately and decided that raising it to Julian would create problems they did not want to own. Victoria was in back-to-back investor calls. Dennis, the floor supervisor, who would have escalated it, was on a scheduled day off that he could not cancel without explanation. The Aurora-X prototype ran through its 48th hour of extended testing with the particular confidence of a system that has been told it is fine by every instrument designed to measure it. At 11 minutes past 2 in the morning on the 3rd day following Caleb's termination, the primary thermal coupling on the Aurora-X prototype failed. The failure was not an explosion in the theatrical sense, though it was violent enough. A component designed to manage the transfer of thermal energy between the engine's 2 primary systems reached a stress threshold. It had not been engineered to survive, and it failed in the way that structural components fail when they have been pushed too far for too long catastrophically, completely releasing the energy it had been containing in a single uncontrolled event. The sound was heard in 3 separate buildings. The automated fire suppression system activated within 4 seconds. The emergency shutdown protocol cascaded through the production line with the mechanical certainty of a system doing exactly what it had been designed to do, which was to stop everything. The lights on the production floor dimmed to emergency level. The robots froze in position. The conveyor system stopped mid-cycle. The facility's control room filled with alarm indicators in the particular red-orange palette that meant a situation had moved beyond monitoring into intervention. 2 safety officers were on site within 7 minutes, and they found a production floor that had, in the space of a few seconds, become a very expensive and very still landscape of halted machinery and the sharp chemical smell of fire suppressant. Julian Cross was called at 2:22 in the morning. He arrived at the facility at 3:15, during which time he had received 4 calls from senior engineering staff and 1 from Victoria's assistant, and had spent most of the drive constructing a sequence of explanations that he found upon arrival were inadequate to the scale of what he was looking at. Victoria Sterling arrived at 3:50. She walked the production floor in silence for 6 minutes. She looked at the thermal coupling failure site. She looked at the halted production line. She looked at the data on the control room screens, which were now showing clearly, without any possibility of interpretive flexibility, the cascade pattern that Caleb had described in its exact sequence: thermal variance pressure differential, coupling stress structural failure propagation. She stood in the control room looking at the data and said nothing for a long time. Arthur Hayes, chairman of Titan Motors Investment Consortium, arrived at the facility at 7 in the morning. He was in his mid-60s, a man who had spent 4 decades watching companies make expensive decisions based on assumptions that turned out to be incorrect. Consequences are, in the end, inevitable. He walked the floor with 2 of his associates. He asked questions. He listened to the answers. He looked at the repair estimates, which ran into 9 figures when the full scope of the cascade damage to the production infrastructure was included. He looked at the investor presentation timeline and then at the launch schedule. He looked at the morning's preliminary analysis from the engineering team, which confirmed that the fault origin was exactly where Caleb had said it was and had developed exactly as Caleb had said it would. Then Arthur Hayes asked a single question, and the question was not about the engineering, and it was not about the timeline. Where is Turner? Caleb was in his garage when Victoria's car pulled up outside the house. The garage was a single-car structure attached to the side of the house that he and Noah had converted over 2 years of weekend work into a workspace. It was not large, but it was organized with the precision that Caleb brought to everything he maintained, and it had the feeling of a place where the person working in it was entirely at home. Tools hung on pegboard in the specific arrangement of a man who knows where everything is in the dark. A shop lamp cast clean white light over the work surface. The concrete floor had been painted gray 3 years ago and was still clean in the corners. He was replacing the alternator on a neighbor's sedan, a job he had agreed to do as a favor for $30 in labor, which was less than the work was worth and more than the neighbor could comfortably afford. Noah was on a stool in the corner of the garage, working through a school assignment with his textbook propped against a toolbox. He looked up when the car stopped on the street and watched the passenger door open with the evaluating attention that he had learned by proximity from his father. He studied the car first, its model, its color, the way it was parked, and then the person who got out of it, and then he looked at his father, who had not looked up from the alternator but whose shoulders had shifted in the way they shifted when he was aware of something new entering his environment. Victoria Sterling walked up the driveway. She was not in the clothes she wore to investor meetings. She was wearing what she had put on at 3 in the morning when the call came in, and she had not changed since, and she looked like someone who had spent the past several hours confronting the full weight of a decision she could not undo. Caleb looked at her from under the hood of the neighbor's sedan. He did not say anything. "We need your help," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "I know." The coupling failed. "The cascade pattern is exactly what you described." She paused. "I owe you an acknowledgement before I ask you for anything. What you said was correct. We should have listened." Caleb closed the hood of the sedan and wiped his hands on a shop towel. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has been waiting for something and is not surprised it arrived, but is not especially gratified by it either. "What's the current state of the line?" "Shutdown. The AI diagnostic systems are giving us conflicting readings on the extent of the secondary damage. We can't get a reliable picture of what's salvageable, because the sensors aren't designed to read that failure mode," Caleb said. "No." He folded the shop towel. He looked at Noah, who was watching from the stool with the same steady attention he always brought to things that mattered. Something passed between them, not words, not gesture, but the particular communication of two people who have spent years learning each other's silences. "The systems you have won't tell you what you need to know," Caleb said. "I can tell you what you need to know. I understand that. Then we should go." Victoria looked around the garage at the clean tool organization at the neighbor's car at the stool where Noah was sitting with his textbook, and she looked at it all with the expression of someone encountering a version of things that is different from any version they had imagined. "I'll have my assistant arrange," she started. "I'll drive myself," Caleb said. He went inside the house and came back in 3 minutes with a jacket on. He told Noah to call if anything came up. Noah said he would. He said it with the unconcerned calm of a boy who has been left in charge of himself before which he had been, and who trusted his father to return which he did. Victoria watched this exchange with something in her face that she could not quite contain, and she turned back toward her car to give them the privacy of it. Caleb arrived at the Titan facility 40 minutes later. He drove his own truck. He parked in the general lot. He walked through the main entrance, carrying the same worn metal toolbox he had carried out 48 hours before, and the people on the production floor who saw him come in responded in different ways depending on what they knew about what had happened. Dennis, who had returned from his day off and had been on site since 4 in the morning, met him at the entrance to the production bay and said simply, "Good to have you back," in the tone of a man who means it without embellishment. Several technicians who had been on the floor during the original incident nodded with the particular relief of people who have been waiting for the person who should have been heard the first time. Julian Cross stood near the control room monitoring station and said nothing when Caleb walked past. His expression was the expression of a man who has lost something he cannot name, which is the most expensive kind of loss. Caleb walked to the center of the production floor and stood still for 2 minutes. The emergency systems were still partially active. The facility had a different sound, now quieter in some registers, irregular in others, the sound of a system that has been interrupted mid-cycle and has not yet been told what comes next. He listened to it. He walked slowly along the line, stopping at 3 points, leaning close to machinery without touching it, listening with the undivided attention of someone reading very carefully. On the 3rd stop, he crouched down beside a secondary coupling module in the eastern section of the line and listened for 20 seconds. Then he stood and looked at the engineering team that had gathered at a respectful distance. "The primary failure point is already documented," he said. but you have a secondary stress fracture in the eastern coupling module. It's not visible and your sensors aren't showing it because it's in the internal bore, not the outer housing. If you restart the line without replacing it, the cycle load will bring it to failure in approximately 3 to 4 hours. The engineering team's senior member, a woman named Claire, who had been at the facility for 12 years, looked at Julian. Julian looked at the monitoring screens. The screens showed nothing in the eastern module. Julian looked back at Caleb. On what basis he started? "Pull the module," Claire said. She said it quietly, but she said it with the finality of someone who has been watching a particular dynamic long enough to know what happens when it continues. "We'll examine it." The module was pulled. It took 40 minutes to remove it from the line. When Claire's team examined the internal bore with a fiber optic scope, they found the fracture. It was small enough that the scope required 2 passes to confirm it. It was large enough, given the cycle loads of the Aurora-X powertrain, to have brought the module to failure within the time Caleb had described. The production floor was very quiet for a moment, in which a number of things that had been true for a long time became visible to a number of people who had been working hard not to see them. Arthur Hayes, who had been standing near the control room entrance during the module examination, spoke first. He spoke quietly and without particular drama, in the tone of a man stating something that has become self-evident. The AI system did not prevent this failure. It did not diagnose it. It did not identify the secondary fault. Caleb Turner prevented this failure, and we terminated him for it. He looked at Julian. "I would like a full accounting of the diagnostic threshold adjustments made in the 48 hours prior to the coupling failure." He paused. "All of them." With timestamps and authorization logs, Julian began to respond. Arthur raised one hand, a small gesture that stopped the response before it formed. It took Caleb 11 days to work through the full diagnostic assessment of the production line. He worked with Claire's team, and the working relationship that developed between them had the character of a collaboration between people who had always been on the same side but had never been in the same room at the same time. Claire was precise and thorough and had no investment in any explanation other than the true one. Her team responded to Caleb with the respect that competence generates when it has been clearly demonstrated, which is a different and more durable kind of respect than anything generated by title. The full scope of the damage assessment, when compiled, was more extensive than Victoria had hoped, and less extensive than she had feared. 3 sections of the production line required significant rework. The prototype itself was salvageable, but the launch timeline required an adjustment of 9 weeks. The investor presentation was rescheduled. Several institutional investors expressed serious concern. Arthur Hayes managed those conversations with the same patient directness he brought to everything else, and the conversations were difficult but survivable. Titan Motors did not collapse, which had been the outer edge of what could have happened. But the company's near-term trajectory had changed, and everyone in the executive structure knew it. What also changed, though more quietly, was the internal structure of how certain things were understood. Julian Cross retained his position, but the authority structure of his division was restructured, so that the AI diagnostic systems were treated as instruments rather than arbiters, as tools that told you where to look, rather than as systems that could tell you what was true. This was not framed publicly as a demotion because institutional face-saving is a currency that organizations spend constantly and invisibly, but it was understood internally with precision. Victoria requested a meeting with Caleb on the 12th day, after the diagnostic assessment was complete and the production line rework was underway. She met him in a conference room on the facility's 2nd floor, not in her office, which Caleb noted and understood as a choice rather than a coincidence. She had a proposal. She laid it out without preamble. She wanted Caleb to take a newly created position, Director of Technical Integrity. It was not a role that had existed at Titan Motors before, and the title was less important than the function, which was to establish a human-led diagnostic protocol that operated alongside the AI systems, with explicit authority to halt any testing or production process based on findings that the automated systems had not flagged. The position came with a salary that was, by any measure, a significant change from Caleb's previous compensation. It came with benefits, and with the specific legally binding authority to do the thing he had tried to do and been fired for. Caleb listened to the full proposal before he responded, which was how he listened to everything. "I'll take the role," he said. "One condition." Victoria waited. "The technicians who flagged anomalies before the failure, the night shift worker, the 2 engineers on your team who didn't escalate because they were afraid of the consequences, they need to know their instincts were right, and they need, state, to know that raising those instincts in the future is not only permitted but required." He looked at her directly. The problem wasn't just what your systems didn't catch. It was that your people didn't feel safe saying what they heard. Victoria looked at him for a moment. She nodded slowly with the expression of someone hearing something they had known and had not known they knew. "I'll address it," she said. "In writing," Caleb said. "Policy, not conversation." "In writing," she agreed. He took the position. Noah visited the Titan facility for the first time on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after Caleb's return, when the production floor was running at reduced capacity and the foot traffic was light enough to move through without disruption. Caleb walked him through the facility, the way he showed Noah everything that mattered to him without narration, letting the place speak in the sounds it made, stopping at points where something was interesting and letting Noah stand and listen until he was done listening. He did not explain what the machines were doing in terms of function or purpose. He let Noah experience them as sound first, the same way Caleb had first experienced machinery as a language that preceded understanding something to be heard before it could be known. Noah asked few questions. This was unusual for him in most contexts, but in the context of machinery, he became quieter than he was anywhere else, and Caleb had always understood this as the sign of a specific and genuine attention rather than passivity. When they passed through the eastern production bay, Noah paused twice to listen to things that Caleb heard as well, and had already logged in his ongoing assessment of the line's recovery. He did not ask Noah about either of them, because the purpose of the visit was not evaluation. The purpose of the visit was simpler than that, to let his son see where he worked, and to see in the seeing what that work was. Near the center of the production floor, Noah stopped and tilted his head to one side in a gesture so familiar that Caleb recognized it before he understood what was causing it. "What is it?" Caleb asked. "Something in that conveyor," Noah said. He pointed toward the eastern bay. "A kind of rattle. It's very small." Caleb listened. He heard it on the second cycle. A minor misalignment in the conveyor tensioner, not significant now, but the kind of thing that accumulated under cycle loads and became significant later. He looked at his son, who was standing with his head still tilted, still listening. "Good ear," Caleb said. Noah looked at him with the expression of a boy who has been told something he already knew, and who is pleased to have it confirmed anyway. "You taught me," he said. They stood there for another few minutes in the particular silence of a production floor mid-cycle, listening together to a machine that was for the moment doing what it had been built to do. Later that week, Caleb submitted a maintenance notice on the eastern conveyor tensioner. Claire's team found the misalignment on the first inspection. The adjustment took 20 minutes. Nothing was interrupted. In Arthur Hayes's office on the 37th floor of Titan Motors corporate headquarters, a building with sight lines that extended on clear days to the edge of the metropolitan sprawl, there was a filing system that his assistant maintained with the thoroughness of someone who understands that an organization's memory is one of its primary assets. Among the files in that system reclassified after the Aurora-X incident from the inactive personnel archive to the active operations reference was a folder bearing a tab with Caleb Turner's name. Inside the folder was a single page of internal correspondence dated from the year Caleb had joined the company, written by the facility director who had processed his original application. The page contained a summary assessment of Caleb's qualifications, an acknowledgement that his formal credentials did not meet the standard requirements for the position, and a recommendation that he be hired anyway based on the unusual specificity of the skills he demonstrated during the Canaan 2250 evaluation process. At the bottom of the page below the formal recommendation, there was a handwritten note. Arthur Hayes read it on the morning after the Director AO of Technical Integrity appointment was confirmed, and then set the page on his desk and looked at it for a moment before returning it to the folder. The note said, "Internal note. The most accurate engine diagnostic specialist this facility has ever evaluated." He had written it himself 11 years ago, when he was still on the facility's advisory board and still reviewed hiring decisions personally. He had forgotten he had written it. He was glad looking at the folder now that the instinct it recorded had outlasted the forgetting. Outside the building in the parking lot below, Caleb Turner's truck idled in the late afternoon light. He sat with the window down, listening to it run the way he always did. The engine turned smoothly. The sound was clean and even, and entirely as it should be. He put the truck in gear and drove home to his son.